Resiliency is something that every deck builder strives for in Commander specifically. You want to make sure that even if you get board wiped for the 4th or 5th or even 6th time in a game, that you can find a way back in it. And today I decided to go over a deck that my good friend at my LGS likes to play. Have you ever played against a deck where you feel like you've completely shut it out, but they still have plenty of mana available, plenty of resources in their hand, and even rebuild their board state within 2, maybe even just 1 turn? That is this deck. Have you ever played against a low to the ground aggro deck and you just wait until you have 4/4s and they can't do anything? Or you wait until you have your big tramplers and they can't do anything against you. And this deck can go over that while still having low to the ground creatures. This deck is one of the most interesting mono green decks I think I've ever seen in my life. This deck is Ayula, Queen Among Bears. Ayula is probably one of the most interesting mono green commanders out there. Not only is Ayula an extremely rare type of creature, which is bears, but also Ayula can be both at the same time. It can be aggro and it can be control all at once. And this is exactly what that deck leans into heavily. Before we go into the specifics, I can give you a quick overrun of what this deck does. This deck gets Ayula out really early due to the fact it only costs 2 mana. Then from there, you have an assortment of 2, 3, and 4 cost bears that are able to make sure that your Ayula gets to around a 6/6 or even an 8/8. And then from there, you play those bears and you make sure that no threat on the board sticks there for too long. Any mana dork you play is gone. Your commander is gone. Any value engine that is a creature is gone. This deck is able to shut down pretty much every single other deck at the table, rip a Rishkar's expertise, and then win the game a couple turns after. It is extremely hard to stop and very resilient to board wipes due to the amount of card draw, card selection, and digging it has within its deck. So without further ado, let's take a deep dive into this Ayula deck and talk about how it works fully, as well as how you can probably try to take this approach in your deck building as well. So the most common way of stopping a normal creature-based green strategy is by waiting for them to overextend and casting a Wrath. But what happens when the aggro deck is not in a race to kill you, but more in a race to draw as many cards as possible and always have an answer? There have been times where I've played against this deck, and even though I am able to get a Wrath off even as early as turn 4, the deck already has 14 cards in hand, and I know the game is basically over. Add on top of that the fact that a lot of the people at my LGS don't usually run a lot of board wipes, and you are completely cooked if you are trying to beat this in any form of creature-based strategy. So how does Ayula actually want to work? Well, like I said in the beginning, you're really trying to get Ayula out as quickly as possible, but not so quickly as the fact that you can just take a Swords to Plowshare on turn 2. You're typically wanting to play Ayula on either turn 3 or turn 4, and just taking that risk of, does my opponent really want to take an entire turn off to remove my commander, or does that opponent want to get ahead as quickly as possible? If your opponents end up actually destroying this commander as early as possible, they are significantly behind in terms of tempo, and at the end of the day, they don't actually stop you from playing your bears and getting back into the game as early as turn 4. However, if they don't remove Ayula, you know that on turn 3, you're going to play a bear, make Ayula a 4/4, and at that point, Ayula wins pretty much every single early combat or early fight that she wants to take. Then as the game goes on and on, you constantly have the choice of playing Ayula the bear and making it bigger, or just fighting every single threat that gets put onto the table. The reason this deck is so resilient is because you cannot beat it through blocking due to the ginormous commander that just fights every creature that's a threat to it, and you can't win through wrathing due to how many cards it ends up drawing. You have to almost out aggro it and just beat it as much as possible because this deck loves greedy players. This deck really plays into the fact that Commander is a greedy format. Everyone is trying to do this exact strategy. Run out your commander early and play synergy pieces. So when I tell you that this deck wants to do that, you probably think it's nothing special. However, when every single other deck is trying to do this, especially with creature-based strategies, this deck is able to completely topple those strategies just as fast as they arrive. The second you play your 4-drop commander, it is dead the next turn thanks to Ayula. And by the time you're able to cast it for 6, Ayula is an 8/8 and it's swinging at you for borderline commander lethal, and then post-combat, it's able to fight your commander once again. It puts the entire pod in a situation where they have to question, do I want to bring out my commander, which is the entire strategy of my deck, or a really useful value engine to my deck, because if I do, there's a chance that it just immediately gets removed from this commander. But if I choose to remove the commander, I still have a ton of bears that are getting buffed by each other coming directly at me. This deck is really good at putting your opponents in difficult situations and having the entire table almost have to work together in order to find a solution to the bear. The friend that plays this loves green. He plays a lot of green. He plays a lot of big mana decks that like to play a lot of creatures and be extremely powerful and resilient. That is sort of his play style. And I think this deck in particular encapsulates all of that in one single deck. So now let's talk about how you can implement this kind of philosophy into your deck building. I think resiliency is really good, and we've talked in the past about quantitative decks versus qualitative decks. Every single card in this deck is extremely quantitative. Every card is dedicated to the strategy of play bears and hit my opponent and draw a ton of cards. When your entire deck is based around one simple strategy that's easily repeated and has some sort of good payoff either in the command zone or plenty of payoffs within the deck itself, like overruns, decks become much easier to build, and they actually become a lot more streamlined and much more powerful. Resiliency, in my opinion, can be described as having a strategy, making sure all of your cards are tangential or directly aligned with that strategy, and having plenty of draw payoffs through this strategy. One thing is very clear about Commander: if you can see more cards than your opponents in an EDH game, you are probably in a very good spot. So if you can find a strategy that you enjoy playing and find plenty of ways to draw cards within that strategy, you are one step closer to having a more resilient deck and a more resilient game plan. Then from there you can add in those vegetables that we all like playing, which is interaction and ramp and a good land base and all the other good stuff we love as Commander players. This philosophy is extremely prominent in a singleton format like Commander. It's not like 60 card where you can put a one of and have that be an ace in the hole, or have that be something where if you do draw it, it's great. If you don't draw it, your deck is still fine. Every card is a one of. So you really want to look for cards that are able to focus on the only strategy you're trying to build. It doesn't matter if it's bears, it doesn't matter if it's druids, it doesn't matter if it's snakes or dragons or merfolk or anything. My friend has a very simple philosophy to his gameplay, which is play one strategy and have a ton of cards that allow you to draw cards based off of that strategy. And that right there is probably the best advice in terms of resilient decks. So thank you, Trinalicious, and thank you, Ayula, for being such great examples today, and I'll see you guys all in the next video.